Shabbat Shalom. I love Raiders of the Lost Ark, the movie, because without it, many Americans, including American Jews, would have no idea what I meant when I said the Ark of the Covenant. When people think of an ark in the Bible, they think of a giant boat. But even though it's a completely different word, the ark that is the Ark of the Covenant is something that is very different, as we have seen throughout the construction instructions over the last few parshiot. What was the ark's job? It was a box. Okay. We're back with the basic, it's an aron. It is a box that is there to carry the tablets, because we need a special box for this. Are they like radioactive that we need gold to block the emanations from us? Is that why all the Nazis' faces melted when they opened up the box? Well, what was that whole scene trying to portray? That you're not supposed to open it. Okay, but we did open it. I mean, you don't put stuff in a box and then close it with a lid if you don't plan to open the lid and take stuff out every now and then. So what went wrong and what was happening? What melted their faces? They were unauthorized to open. And indeed, we do see in the Haftorah that Solomon has learned from his father's failures, not about opening the ark per se, but that the ark should be carried into Jerusalem, carried rather than stuck on the back of a wagon, something that happened during his father's lifetime, that when the ark began to wobble and someone reached up to study it as they would any other piece of furniture, they got dead from that process. So we definitely know that the ark can be dangerous. But is that just what's being exhibited here? I'm making sure we really even remember this movie, because this wasn't that long ago, and it was the only good Raiders of the Lost Ark movie, for my money. Why were the Nazis looking for it in the first place? The power of God. And that's really, I think, what they were trying to portray at the end, that the power of God was not going to bend the knee to the Third Reich. It was not going to bend the knee to anyone, in fact, because that's not how it works. However, this did continue to perpetuate a certain myth that I believe that many of us continue to hold to. It's one that is perhaps exacerbated by things like the Haftorah that we read today, as well as the generic understanding of the building of the Mishkan. So let's back up a little bit. We need to understand the purpose of the Mishkan, because we don't have it, and that means its purpose could be going unfulfilled, and that may be important. So the purpose of the Mishkan, I talked about this a little bit more last night, but the short version was that it was supposed to be this meeting place. It was going to be a place of sanctity. After all, as we said, there's the Holy of Holies within it, and within that was where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, and with the Mishkan present in the community could feel God's presence among them. As we traveled, we would carry the Mishkan forward, as exemplified by the Ark, which would eventually come to rest in whatever new campsite we were in, and then the Mishkan would be constructed in order for it to be housed. But now we would sanctify a new place, that we didn't have to remain trapped at Mount Sinai, that we could have an experience of God's holiness wherever we parked the motorhome, wherever we parked our RV. Everybody with me so far? And then when it was time to pull up stakes, we would lift the tent and pack it up and carry the ark to the next place, and the process would repeat itself. And what happened to the place that we left? It was desanctified. It was no longer holy. There were not little oases of holiness hidden across the Sinai Peninsula. Once the Aron left, once the Mishkan was deconstructed, it went back to being just uninhabitable dirt. Everybody's with me. Good? Which means that God's presence, or at least our perception of God's presence, is traveling with the box, is traveling with the tent. It was not localized in a particular place. It was localized around the box. This is what, of course, was being represented in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, and indeed is represented in many people's conception, that this was sort of a magnet, if you will, or if you like, the loudspeaker for God, and thus where it went, God went too. Thus, God would always be with us, and yay, victory in the movies language. Everybody's with me so far. Good. Where's the Mishkan now? Some people have claimed Ethiopia, not likely. Some people have claimed hidden. Most people have admitted that, you know what, it was captured during one of any different times of conquest by our enemies, and they would have melted it down for the gold, and just used it as literally a cash box. And thus it is gone. Sorry, no melting faces. They took it, they used it, and it has been ground into dust and spent 1,000 times over in the courses of antiquity now. So what happened to God's presence? It's everywhere, but wasn't it everywhere before? So it was everywhere before, and yet the Shekhinah, the God's presence as we call it in Hebrew, was somehow wrapped up with this Mishkan, which later turned into the temple, like we discussed in the Haftorah. But when both the Mishkan and then the temple was reduced to ruins, God's presence is everywhere, but also kind of nowhere now. Because after all, it was the box that made it palpable. It was the box that made it accessible. It was the Mishkan and the temple that gave it a localized property. And saying that God is everywhere is unfortunately the spiritual equivalent for many of us of saying that God is nowhere. And that's kind of rough, which is why we should be very thankful that our sages tried to explain this in antiquity. When the Romans destroyed the Second Temple, our sages too were, shaken. They were terrified of what this meant. Although the temple itself had become very corrupt in the latter part of its time of the Second Temple period under the Roman administration and the corrupt kings that were descended from Herod, and the Kohanim likewise were extremely corrupt during that time period. That's one thing that Jesus was actually correct about, was that the Kohanim in the temple were not running well. But nonetheless, there was still a feeling that although it was mishandled, and although the institution had fallen into hard times, that nonetheless there was still this centerpiece of God's presence in the world, and that the temple could somehow be redeemed, could be brought back, could be properly reformed, and then it was destroyed. And the rabbis had never quite anticipated that. Obviously we knew from history that it could be destroyed. The Babylonians had done it 500 years earlier, but no one was quite expecting that to happen again. And the question came, so where is the Shekhinah now? Where is God's presence now? Yes, God is everywhere, and yes, whenever I pray, whenever I am living a Jewish life, I can feel God's presence. But let's be honest, when you went to the temple for Pesach and they were slaughtering your lamb that was going to be part of your Passover sacrifice, standing there in the Temple Mount on the courtyards felt different. God felt more accessible there than anywhere else you stood. And as such, people were rightly disturbed. But the rabbis pointed something out. They said, look, this Mishkan that we had, this temple that we had, it represented God's sovereignty. The same way that a king would have a palace, or a king would have an entourage if he was traveling. Wherever the king would station himself, then that would be the royal precincts for the moment. And that was perfectly understandable and fine. But it wasn't the palace that made the king the king. It wasn't the entourage that made the king the king. What made the king was that people acknowledged the king as king. It's a very early form of the rule by the consent of the masses. The idea being that you're not a king if no one actually does what you say. And indeed, prior to the modern times, this was very much a universal understanding of what it meant to be a sovereign over a territory. Sovereignty didn't mean no one else gets to touch my stuff. Sovereignty meant all the people under my control acknowledge my control of their territory. And that when I, sitting in my palace or out with my entourage issue a new law, then the people will obey the law. And it doesn't matter how fancy a hat I have, it doesn't matter how big a palace I have, if I issue a law and nobody listens, my sovereignty is gone. I'm no longer king. I may be king in name, I may be king in ancestry, I can roll out my family tree and show you why I should be king and why I have a claim to this territory and a claim to the throne. But if no one is willing to acknowledge me as king, as exemplified by their willingness to follow my laws, I'm no king. Everybody with me so far? I know it's radically different because we eventually reshaped how we have nation states, where now it's not about whether or not we pay attention to a king, but there are still elements of this, of the sovereignty of even a modern nation state will break down when the citizenry no longer listens to the rules from the government. We can talk about that some other time when we want to get political. Maybe on a Wednesday if you want to stop by for the We Need to Talk discussions. But what does this mean about Judaism? Well, our ancestors, the sages, the Chachamim, they said, look, God was never God. God was never Melech just because of the box, just because of the house. God was Melech because we acknowledged Torah. We acknowledged God's instructions. We acknowledged the mitzvot. We acknowledged the commandments, God's laws, just like it would work for any king. And thus, wherever we are in the world, when we are observant of God's law, when we are putting God's ideas into practice because they are God's ideas, we are acknowledging God's sovereignty still, and, in their metaphor, we thus stand within 4 amot, it's roughly a 6 foot by 6 foot square, of God's sovereignty at that point, and the Shekhinah stands with us. That we create a pocket of God's sovereignty wherever we happen to stand, just as the Mishkan would create holiness wherever it stood and then move on. Wherever we stand and act in a way that is in accordance with God's rules, we are creating a pocket of God's divine sovereignty as powerful as the Mishkan, as powerful as the Temple of Jerusalem. And they said something even more radically. They said, not only can we create that, but indeed, God has gone into exile with us. That the Shekhinah is not hanging out on the Temple Mount, waiting for the restoration of the building, that the Shekhinah is invoked and found with us, accessible anywhere we are, when we are following the halakha. When we care enough to still listen to those laws, to still acknowledge our Melech, then in that area around us, we are standing in the Holy of Holies. We are in the presence of Shekhinah, and we are saying to the world, you can take our box, you can take our temple, you can even take our country, but you cannot diminish God's sovereignty. Not while I stand, and not while I listen to those rules. You can make me homeless, but you cannot take it away from me. Raiders of the Lost Ark was a beautiful movie and a great action flick, one of my all-time favorites. But I'm afraid that the screenwriter got this wrong. That the Ark of the Covenant does not represent God's power. We represent God's power in this world. The Ark was a useful focal point. It was a wonderful telescope, as I mentioned in the introduction to the Torah, to help us see farther than we might otherwise, but it was never meant to be the point. It was never meant to be an object of veneration, and just having it doesn't give you any special power. What gives us special power, and what has allowed the Jewish people to endure without all of the other elements that are normally necessary for a nation to endure, a land, a government, sovereignty over territory, all of those things not being ours, is because we have continued to say, wherever I'm standing, I don't care if it's Russia, I don't care if it's India, I don't care if it's Ethiopia, I don't care if it's Canada, wherever I am standing, this is God's kingdom. Because I am a citizen of God's Torah. And that can never be taken from us. And so wherever we went, we were the Mishkan. Wherever we went, we brought the Shekhinah. We brought that palpable sense of God's presence. It is so tempting and so desirable to want something to do that for us. Indeed, that was part of the trap of the golden calf in the first place, and we still fall into that. Imagining that we need to be in a certain place, or we need to dress a certain way, or we need to be in Jerusalem to have access to greater holiness. All of those things psychologically can help. But if we think they are the only things that help, then we are fundamentally missing out on the truth that our sages recognized when the temple fell to the Romans. That we are the carrier of the Holy Ark. We are the carrier of the tablets of the covenant. We are still in relationship with God wherever we stand. And that just means we have to live that way. And live that way, and whether you are in a hovel or whether you are in a mansion, whether you are on this side of the equator or a different one, you are still in God's kingdom. And as such, you can rely on your King. Shabbat Shalom.